It's the 1st of September, 1939. You, for the past 21 years, have had to deal with the radical shift of the globe following the First World War. Fascist idealism would slowly consume Italy, and the world would struggle to recover from the economic collapse of the Great Depression, giving rise to a specific name in Germany, Adolf Hitler. And to find some semblance of normalcy within all this chaos, you would take your family and sit in front of the television and turn on the BBC broadcast. But as the cartoon fades to black, nothing follows. BBC would no longer broadcast because Poland was just invaded. Howdy, and welcome to the Native Naturalist channel. And today we're going to be talking about a project that was conducted during one of the worst concoctions of global instability. During World War II, like any other war, we saw a push for new advancement. You would have things like the radar and the computer rush. But there's one project in this topic of conversation that I don't think gets talked about as much as it should. And what is this project, you may ask? Well, it technically didn't have an official name until it was adopted by a later branch of the military, but we'll get to that later. Project X-Ray was an operation that utilized bats, and yes, the flying mammal, to be used as an incendiary device against Japanese buildings. But before we get to the whole point A to point bat, we need to take a step back and talk about one specific individual. Dr. Lionel Adams was a dentist based out of Pennsylvania, but in his free time, he was considered by friends and colleagues as a eccentric inventor. And the reason why this matters is that from the establishment of airmail to the late 1920s, if you didn't live in a large metropolitan area, it was a little difficult to get mail delivered out to you. And Dr. Adams saw this as an oversight. So with the assistance of a couple Boeing engineers, he would develop a pickup apparatus in 1928. And the pickup apparatus is actually a pretty simple concept where instead of having to have a whole airstrip to pick up mail in these rural areas, essentially you would be playing a claw game where you would just pick up and do kind of a little bit of a drive-by to get the mail from these rural areas back into the metropolitan area. And after the invention of this pickup apparatus, he would quit his dentistry practice and travel all around the country to different aviation conferences and different military conferences to try to sell this apparatus. And during these different networking events, he would talk to various people from the military up into airmail. But for the case of our story, he talks to one specific person that is going to be a key part later, Eleanor Roosevelt. She was actually incredibly interested in these apparatuses to the point to where she would often find herself doing ride-alongs where they were picking up the mail, and she would have conversations with Dr. Adams quite frequently. And now we're going to jump about 10 years into the future to December of 1941. And if you are a bit of a history buff or just paid attention in high school history, you'll know that this is when Pearl Harbor occurred. And as news spread about the event, we would hop over from the North Pacific over to the mainland, where we would find Dr. Adams in a newly established national park in New Mexico called Carlsbad Caverns. And as a result of the recent attacks plus him visiting this cavern, he would say this: "Could those millions of bats be fitted with incendiary bombs and be dropped from planes? What could be more devastating than such a firebomb attack?" And so with this thought process, he would go out and write a letter to Theodore Roosevelt in January of 1942, basically just outlining the whole process in which he envisioned winged fire starters. And with the push of the First Lady, Theodore would write back to Dr. Adams saying this: "This man is not a nut. It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but worth looking into." And so after being greenlit by the US government and Theodore Roosevelt, they would give him the funding to make these bat fire bombs, but they needed to comprise a team first, which comprised of the following. We have Dr. Jack von Blocker, a mammologist from the Los Angeles County Museum. We have Jack Colfer and Harry Fletcher, his two high school assistants. And I would like to give a specific shout out to Jack Colfer because he would later write a book detailing everything that happened within this project. Bat Bomb, World War II's other secret weapon. And it's honestly a good read. I enjoyed it, and if you have more interest about this topic or the individuals that were in it that I don't go into specifics about, I would definitely recommend reading it. I'll put a link in the description below, but yeah. We would have Lieutenant Tim Holt, who was a pilot, Bobby and Eddie Harold, who were ex-Marines, and Pasty Batista, an ex-gangster who claimed to have worked with Al Capone, and lastly, but more importantly, Theodore Fischer. And if you're familiar with military tactics or Vietnam specifically, and you're wondering why that sounds so familiar, he was the inventor of napalm, which will be a huge contributor to this project, but we'll get into that. And so now that the team's together, they get the okay from the US government to pull Mexican free-tailed bats out of the caverns of Carlsbad and put them in a separate hibernaculum within the park base that they were given. And if you're unfamiliar with bat terms or just like habitat terms, hibernaculum is just an area where bats tend to like stay or hibernate. And I'll put a photo right here so that you get like a visual representation. And now we get to the biggest part, which is creating the payload that these bats are going to carry. And that's going to be using cellulose capsules that are going to contain napalm through Dr. Fleischer. And these little capsules of napalm will be later classified as H2s. So I'll just continue to call them H2s from now on. But yeah, so H2s are just cellulose capsules that contain napalm. And now that they had these incendiary devices, the next step was to create a deployment device where they can house all these bats and drop them on what would be thousands of houses made out of wood and paper. But that's besides the point. And so essentially the team would design a metal shell that, for a lack of a better term, kind of just looked like a bomb casing. But on the inside, there were little shelves that kind of look like egg cartons. And I'll put a photo of like the internals and externals up here somewhere. But the thought process was to have a B-25 deploy this shell at a high enough altitude to where once it got close enough to the ground, the bats would be awake and be trying to escape the shell. And because it's in the middle of daybreak, the bats would immediately try to seek shelter in Japanese buildings and structures. And the C2 capsules would eventually set off, causing all the paper and wooden structures to burn. But it wasn't just one shell, it was closer to 25, which means that we're talking about 26,000 bats that would be dropped on Japanese civilians and government buildings. And before we get to the results of this project, we need to discuss from a biologist's point of view on why this would have gone horribly wrong. Besides the ethics and morality of this whole situation, when you're thinking of putting attachments onto bats like radio telemetry, GPS, nano trackers, stuff like that, pit tags, all of it, you're usually having to account for the fact that you can't put a tracker that's anything more than 5% of a bat's body weight. And yeah, they didn't do that. And these Mexican free-tailed bats, I'll put one up here, are really cool. They're like one of the fastest bats we have on the planet, if not the fastest. They weigh up to like 7 to 12 grams, maybe up to 15 on a spring on a good day. And honestly, probably a little less, considering that there was never an acknowledgement on whether or not there were maternity roosts at Carlsbad Cavern, in which the mothers would probably weigh less than the 7 grams on the low end. So, considering that, these H2s were about half the bat's body weight. They put it on the breast of the actual bat rather than the back, so I don't know how much that would affect their flight, but the fact that it's already heavy enough to weigh them down probably isn't helping. So, yeah. I'll get out of my biologist spiel and we'll go back to what the results were. So in theory, it made sense to both the team that was working on it and the government that this project was a for sure fire way to burn down Japanese buildings and structures. Was it realistic though? It went about as well as predicted. When they initially test the shell, during the deployment through a B-25, they noticed that the actual casing of the bat bomb shell was peeling mid-drop. So that was a big no-no. And another failed attempt was that they tried to test the bat bomb casing drop at a California desert site, which is now a NASA facility site, but they tested it and it worked well in the sense that the bats woke up and flew out of the shell, but then they proceeded to bolt off miles in the nearest direction of a building, which turned out to be civilian ranch housing. So then you had a absolute cluster of military jeeps and military personnel banging on these people's doors, asking landowners to have access to their attics. And obviously that's going to freak some people out, so that was considered a failure as well. And it even got to a point to where 6 live loaded bats escaped their captivity and bolted towards military buildings on the Carlsbad base and proceeded to burn the entire base down. So yeah, it wasn't too great. This project was actually so harmful to the military complex that in 1943, the Air Force would wash its hands from the project, but would be later picked up by the US Navy and be given the infamous name of Project X-Ray. And although Team Atom was given a second life through the US Navy, this project, the Project X-Ray, would get speed blitzed by another secret operation that I think everybody's a little bit more familiar with, which is the Manhattan Project, leading to the complete cancellation of Project X-Ray by the US Navy in 1944, where Team Atom would all go their own separate ways. And if there's anything to learn from this project, it's that in the pursuit of humanity's need for self-destruction, we may seek assistance of nature for our desire, but she will never willingly play our game. If you like the content and you would like to see more, feel free to stick around. And yeah, I think I'm gonna call it here today, and I'll see you on the flip side.